By way of introduction, my name is Steve Wasserman. I'm the new publisher of Heyday Books, based here in Berkeley, founded 40 years ago by the inimitable and nimble genius Malcolm Margolin. I'm former editor of the Los Angeles Times Book Review and a principal architect of the now several decade-long Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, which provided inspiration for Sherilyn Parsons, who is the wizardress of Oz, whose brainchild this festival is, and she's put it together in with extraordinary grace and joy. I hope you've been having a good time, and I wanted to thank you all for coming out.
Oh, come on. You can do better than that.
I want to introduce all of the participants to my left, and I hope I will not mangle their names because, alas, my fluency in the Scandinavian tongues is non-existent, and too many of their names, sad to say, look like bottom lines of eye charts. However, next to me is Line Culpable. Next to her is Anita Fries. Next to her is Kim Leine. Next to him is Jørgen Brekke. And finally, rounding out this distinguished table is Kjersti Skomsvold. They are the authors. I'm given to understand that we would be wrong to assume that because the Scandinavian countries, principally represented on this panel by Norway and Denmark, are relatively small countries, it would be a signal error to assume that all writers who come from relatively small countries all know each other. And we make a kind of presumption that, or at least I seem to encounter many people saying, oh, you all must know each other, and I'm given to understand that most of them are meeting for the first time. Out of curiosity, how many people here have read any contemporary literature from the Nordic countries? That's great. It's odd, it seems to me, the way in which, or curious, the way in which various national literatures can lie fallow, seemingly, for a length of time, for mysterious reasons, and then suddenly there is a kind of eruption of vigorous writing that somehow catches the imagination of people not only in their respective countries, but also peoples elsewhere. And suddenly there's a kind of competition to see who can publish these people well and best. Now, in this country, of course, there was a vogue 50 years ago, a part of the new wave of both cinema as well as literature that from not only from France and Italy, but also from Sweden and other countries as well. In the last, it seems to be in the last, it feels like the last 5 to 10 years, but with mounting excitement, there's been a kind of tsunami of titles. Famously, whatever one makes of his work, Karl Ove Knausgaard, but also others. And not only in novels, but also in cinema and in television in particular. This panel has been given a kind of arbitrary title called Obsession, Very Obsessed. A number of the writers on this panel use the genre of thrillers to explore character and events. Others use a kind of fevered, almost essayistic form to inhabit the voices of their characters and concern themselves with age-old verities as in life and death. So I wanted to ask a very basic question. When they think of the word obsessed, and very obsessed, when it comes to the very act of writing, how do each of them respond to this notion? And is it of any meaning for them when they think about their own work? And I guess partly, if by way of introduction, you might speak a little bit as to introduce yourselves to the audience and to describe the kinds of things that you're thinking about in your work so far.
Well, when I saw the title of this panel, "Be Obsessed, Be Very Obsessed," I had the immediate feeling that we would have to talk about our protagonist in The Boy in the Suitcase and three more books that we've written together, Nina Borg, because if one word describes her, I think it's obsessive. And the inspiration for that really sprung from the fact that basically. We knew we were going to write a couple of books together, starting with The Boy in the Suitcase, and we knew that they would be crime fiction of some sort. And there are a lot of, obviously, policemen and women and journalists and so on as protagonists in crime fiction. We wanted a different kind of protagonist, and so we came up with Nina, who is a Red Cross nurse. And she's been in some of the worst places in the universe. She keeps going out. She keeps abandoning her family, really, and going out to some of the worst disaster zones and war zones all over the globe. She's really a sort of action nurse, I suppose. But when we researched that, we discovered that if you've done that once, and I mean these are not people who are in the army who are told to go. But if you've done that once, you do it again. It's as if you pass through the looking glass, and we wondered, what drove them. They could be sitting safely at home. They could have relatively peaceful, possibly slightly more boring jobs, doing blood samples and giving people dietary advice. But they don't. They go out to these places and they keep doing so. So that's really, we needed to explore that obsession. We needed to explore what created that obsession for our character. And she is very obsessive, and she is actually a highly irritating character to work with, because she doesn't do what she's told, and she keeps doing things that if you look at it objectively, without taking her obsession into the picture, she does things that are quite plainly stupid, and are hurtful to herself and her family, and she does it because she doesn't trust anyone else to be able to save the situation. And she needs to be in control for various reasons that stem from her background. She needs to feel in control, and she feels a lot more in control and a lot more capable when she is actually clutching an arterial bleed than when she's trying to talk to her teenage daughter. So I think I think obsession actually is a theme, or certainly a huge part of the driving mechanism in not just this one, but the other three books in the series.
Can I just? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you'd better steal.
Can I just add, because we don't want to take up since we're two, we don't have to take up all the speaking time. But to me also, Nina is sort of an expression of, I think, a problem that all modern Western people have about to what extent do we have to save the world? Because really, most humans we're designed to live in groups of 50 and to deal with disasters that are right in front of us. And now every time we open the television and the media, we can see a disaster anywhere in the world. So Nina is a person who cannot sort of shut down to an extent where she can ignore it, which most people are able to do and have to do in order to.
She doesn't have the convenient filter that most of us have.
but also I think it's an interesting topic. To what extent, where does our personal responsibility lie, and society's responsibility? How far out does our responsibility reach? Yes.
Obsession. I think obsession is a favorite topic of fiction, and maybe because it's a favorite topic of writers. A lot of writers are obsessed people, and a lot of people generally are obsessed, but most of them aren't able to channel their obsession into something creative. I was obsessed for several years. I made my debut as a novelist 10 years ago, and I'm 54. Freudian slip of tongue. I was obsessed with everything, with women, with food, with drugs, with alcohol, with Greenland, and then I started to write. So I channeled my obsession into the writing, and then I got married, and now I live a sort of bourgeois life. The protagonist of my novel, The Prophets of Eternal Fjord, Morten Falk, is a priest, comes from Norway, and he's also obsessed, because now I've moved my obsessions over to my fictional characters, which is a relief. But he's obsessed by contradictions or opposites with God and Satan, and savagery and bourgeoisie, with duty and lust, with religion and science, and so on and so on. He lives in the 18th century, in the age of rationality. So I see him as a sort of birth of the modern man, coming out of the darkness from the medieval ages. And he's certainly an obsessed man. He goes to Greenland and he lives out his obsession there, just like I did myself in 15 years, from 1989 to 2004. I was born in Norway, raised as a Jehovah's Witness, ran away to Denmark, settled in Denmark with my father, and then went to Greenland 10 years later and lived in Greenland for 10 years. I made my debut with an autobiographical novel in 2007, and have written 6 books, 6 novels since then.
I mean, when I saw the title of this panel, I was sort of puzzled, like the rest of us, because it could mean so many things. Is it about the obsession of the author, or the main character, or the reader? I mean, most authors want their readers to be obsessed with their books, right? So I mean, it could be about how to sort of make the reader participate in your fiction or in your obsession. But anyway, I understand this is as a starting point, we're talking about writing and obsession, and for me, I never really felt writing to be an obsession, or it's more like an obsession that comes and goes. For me, writing is more like playing, or being transformed into something else, and I can go out in and out of it. So it's maybe when I'm writing, or when my fictional universe is sort of taking over, that's more like a possession than obsession, I guess. So and it can last for weeks. I can go into sort of a very concentrated phase where I'm really living my fiction, but it's, you know, writing is also so much work, and there's, you know, long periods, months, when it's just work, really. Mm. But of course, I mean, you have to be intensely interested in what you do in periods, you know.
If I may ask, how did you come to writing as a livelihood that gave you both pleasure and a sense of possession?
Well, I'm always been, you know, I've been a person that has, you know, a lively fancy, or, you know, I always made stories. It took a long time before I understood that these stories belonged in books. But I was working as a journalist when I started writing books. I was working with historical articles and, you know, popular history. So for me, it started with history actually, and kind of an interest for, you know, time and, you know, how to tell a story of something that is lost. And I think maybe, you know, literature is a lot about that. And I write crime fiction. And I think there's, you know, a parallel between, you know, writing history and writing crime fiction, because it's kind of what the detective do in crime stories is, you know, kind of reconstructing something that's been lost, you know, something what happened before the murder, and you don't know who, you know, exactly what went on, so you have to reconstruct. And so I think, I mean, when I started writing, I actually was working on an article, and it kind of grew into being, you know, a fictional story. And that's my first book. I was writing an article about the history of autopsy, and it's kind of developed into this kind of macabre history about 2 murders. And, you know, it felt like, I mean, when I started writing for real, it, you know, it felt very natural for me. It really did. Mm.
And finally, Steve, whose book I'm holding up these books so that at least you have some sense. Her book is called The Faster I Walk, the Smaller I Am. That's the most recent. Or it was an early book.
That's the first book. Yeah, and it's the one that's been translated into English. Yes, obsession. I think writing has been and is an obsession to me now, but I started quite late. My plan in life was to be a computer engineer, but then life doesn't always turn out the way we plan, luckily. And I started writing this book about Mathea, and I think her obsession is death. And she's been living with her husband Epsilon, and while he has been going to work at National Bureau of Statistics, she has been at home knitting air warmers. And I think she has been thinking that that's enough, but as an old woman, she's suddenly all alone in the world, and she gets scared of dying before anyone knows that she has lived. So that's what this book is about, and I have written 4 more books, and yeah, writing has been an obsession, and I have been worried that I'm spending the best years of my life rotting away in front of my desk. But to console myself, I think of the fact that it can also be a bigger realization of life, of inner life, while being out there is more about mirroring the outside world, perhaps. And reading, too, has become an obsession to me, I think. And I think that in great literature, the human effort is the center. So when I feel like the writer is writing out of an existential concern, and then I get more concerned with the writer's mindset than the protagonist's mindset. So when I'm reading Kafka, it's not K I'm interested in. I'm interested in Kafka. What was it he wanted to get away from, and what was it he wanted to find? And I'm interested in the writer's obsession. Why does he have to write these books? Yeah.
The late Susan Sontag, who was deeply interested in Scandinavian literature and countries, once wrote that literature can train and exercise our ability to weep for those who are not us or ours, which in some ways goes against the grain of the fetish in the current culture, in which it is insisted by some that literature be a kind of mirror that reflects our own already existing, if sometimes unacknowledged, interests. And to what extent, at least as you explore your characters in your work, do you lean more toward the Sontag notion of literature as widening our possibilities of empathy, or perhaps the other view, which tends to regard it as holding up a mirror in which we recognize ourselves?
Okay. I actually think it's been very thoroughly proven that people who read tend to be more empathetic to almost everybody else. But anyway, I read somewhere by another, she's a Norwegian American author, Siri Hustvedt. I don't know if you, married to Paul Auster. And she wrote a very interesting book about the brain and how it works. And actually, she wrote that when you read something, it's put into the same box as real experiences. So it feels like your own memories, actually, when you're reading something. So I definitely think it's a way to broaden your own experience and to broaden your world.
I definitely feel that that reading and writing is about the best empathy tool we've got, or the best tool we have for teaching empathy. And I'm actually in Scandinavia probably better known for my books for children and young adults. And if I have an obsession about writing, it's actually not. I mean, the crime fiction I write and the books I write for adults, they're for me. They're fun. Me having fun. But when I write for children, I am exceedingly aware that I actually write something that can change the lives of certain individuals. Because if I write the book that is the first book where a child discovers that reading is not just a task, it can actually be a pleasure. If I write the book that hits that child at the exact right time, I can actually create readers. And I think that is probably the most important job in the world. And I'm very obsessed about that. And I do get... there was a young man who came up to me at a crime convention, actually, not so very long ago. And he was quite shy, and he'd obviously had to work up the nerve. And he thanked me because he told me that a book I wrote called The Shameless Daughter, he told me that was the book that got him reading. He used to be he said, I used to be dyslexic, now I'm an editor. Which and it was actually true. And a little later, he came up to me and gave me a small note, because there are some things. Sometimes the most important things, you have to write them down. You can't. It's not enough just to say them. And he basically handed me a note saying, "Thank you for changing my life." I mean, when you can do that, when you're lucky enough to be able to do that, it's not just a job; it's a duty. And I think it's proved that there are studies that prove that people who do read and you can discuss whether this is a chicken or an egg situation, but they have better employment situation, they have better social connections, and they have a better quality of life. So becoming a reader is probably one of the best things you can do, one of the most life-changing things you can do for other people. So there need to be a lot of books out there to catch them at the right time and get them reading. Actually, that goes for grown-ups too, because not a lot of grown-ups don't read anymore.
When I start to write a book, I have no idea what the difference is between these two notions of writing. I just know that I have to travel somewhere beyond what I'm able to understand. So I'm not really understanding what I'm writing, because that's what keeps my curiosity alive. Not really knowing what I'm writing about. I don't know if I'm writing to be wiser about myself or what, but my first novel, which was autobiographical, was about my own chaotic life. And when it came out, I received several hundred letters where people thanked me. And that's when you start thinking about your book and what is it that I've been writing, and you get to maybe get to know your novel a little better than you did when you were writing it. That's how I feel it. And so I can start talking about it and then maybe understanding it a little better. And the person who wrote to me said, thank you for your novel. It has made me less lonely. And
yes.
This puts it in perspective for me that wasn't there when I was writing it, because I was just taking one step at a time, or fighting my way through some unknown town, even though the subject, of course, is my own life, so I should know it. But it's a riddle, an enigma for me while I'm writing it. And when I close the book and put it, send it to the publisher, and it's out on the street, then I can start trying to understand it. But it's always retrospective, and I don't really want to understand what I'm writing when I'm writing it, because then I would lose interest in it.
Like Kim, when I'm working, I'm not really conscious of the contradiction between the two notions, and I'm not really sure if there is a contradiction at all. You were mentioning Knausgård, and I think, I mean, when he's at his best is when he's, taking his trivial everyday life and, sort of lifting it up into something general that concerns all of us. In a way, I mean, he goes from the really small daily life, trivial things, and then all of a sudden you're in some kind of an essay about, the big things in life. When I create my characters, I always try to, get into their head. I sort of consider them someone else than myself. So, part of the writing is kind of trying to find out who they are. And to do that, I have to, sort of make characters that are, I feel like they're human beings in a way. I write, part of my books are historical. I write in a way, my fiction is my crime fiction is in a way that there's usually some kind of crime going on in to dates or temporary times, and then the mystery goes back in time to some historical story, maybe to the 1700s or something like that. In Dreamless, which is the book you have the cover of there, the story goes back to the 1700s, to a policeman living in Trondheim, a small Norwegian town at the time. He kind of becomes the second character in this book. I've actually written a separate novel about him later because he kind of grew on me. So he just, kept living inside my head. And it's called Niels Beyer. And people have said, they have come to me and they say he's not really a typical 1700 kind of person. I mean, he thinks in ways that it's not typical for the time. And I usually say that's because he's a human being, and I think that's sort of the point. You have to create characters that sort of transgress with the preconceived notions of the reader and yourself. They have to the characters has to be sort of transgress our fordommer, prejudice. That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Anytime there will be a small fee later.
Yeah. Well, you finished it nicely, so I'll leave the word to the next.
Yeah, I think it can be both. I think it's a sign of good literature when you feel this shock of recognition when you're reading, even though the character might seem completely different from you when you first start reading. But I think that this can give you greater empathy for others as well. And yeah, you talked about a reader coming up to you afterwards, and once it was this young boy, he was 13, and he had read this novel about this old woman, and he was ill, so he couldn't participate in school activities and things like that, and he said that he felt exactly like this old woman. And I think you can be just as lonely when you're a 13-year-old boy as when you are a 90-year-old woman. And I think it was David Foster Wallace who said that literature is one of the few places where you both can be confronted with your own loneliness, but also find some relief for it. Yeah. So I think maybe both.
And is there anything that you all might agree upon that would typify or characterize what might be broadly described as Scandinavian literature? Or is this a phony idea? Or is there some truth to the idea of these national literatures as distinct from other countries' literature? Because, of course, one could say of everything that has been observed so far that this seems to be true for all writers everywhere, no matter what their particular language is. So the question I would have is there anything that is specific or inherent in the languages in which you write that seem to frame or give life to a worldview or that is distinct and is specific to your circumstances?
I think really you're asking the wrong people, because it seems to make sense to ask that question of Scandinavian writers, but actually you need to be far more distanced from this. It's very hard to see when you're a part of it. This is something you need to step back from with a distance of miles or years. And then you can see, all right, yes, there are certain unifying traits in that area, but it's not something you're aware of when you're actually inside it. It's like, fish don't think about water sort of situation.
But I'm fairly positive that, of course, we, as writers, reflect the society we're sort of born out of. Now you mentioned the person who was a 17-year-old, 1700s, yes, exactly, and how they were thinking. And of course, if you go back and you can say, okay, this is typical for how people were thinking in the 16th century or the 17th century, and of course there will be things where what we are writing is typical for the way you are thinking in a Scandinavian society. So of course there will be traits that are common, but it would probably be very hard to pinpoint exactly where they are, because it sort of blends into also what's universal for everybody.
But I mean, and actually, that sort of proves my point in the sense that yes, you can say it about that something is typical of the 1700s because you've got centuries of distance from it. It's much easier to see at a distance.
I'm inside Scandinavian literature, so I don't know what Scandinavian literature is. If you ask me the same question about American literature, maybe I had a more qualified answer, because it's hard to see what you're inside yourself. And I get this question all the time when I'm being interviewed abroad, and every time it feels like I've got the question for the first time, and I never can remember what I answered the last time. So I have to reinvent the answer every time.
Oh, Kim,
and this answer is, I really don't know. But something that's characteristic for people in Scandinavia, of course, is that we have to embrace darkness. Darkness is so big a part of our lives, and bad weather. So we have to embrace that, but we also have this constant longing for good weather and sunshine, which we get here in California. So maybe this is part of I don't know, northern or Scandinavian literature is that we embrace the darkness and maybe the evil lurking in the darkness. And that we are always longing for the light and the milder sides of life.
So dark, dreary, depressing, and on top of that, we've got no sense of humor whatsoever.
I think it's probably true that the Scandinavian literature has certain characteristics. And like the rest of the panel, I have kind of a hard time, finding out what it is myself. But you also have to remember that the world has gotten smaller. So I think people of Scandinavia are big travelers, and we are, coming from small countries. We have always, had our eyes lifted, towards the continent and towards, the rest of the world. We take in a lot of, impulses from all over the world. Maybe because we're small countries, but also, because we have always been seafarers and curious people. So I think maybe that's part of why it's hard to say, what is typically Scandinavian, because typically Scandinavian is kind of a mixture of European culture and American culture. American culture has had a big influence on Norwegian culture and Scandinavian culture for many years. So what is, genuinely Scandinavian, it's hard to say.
Yeah, the question I get the most abroad is whether Scandinavians are as lonely and miserable as the character in my book. And I always respond yes.
So that would confirm the suspicion that all the cliches are true, at least up to a point. I'm curious, of the American writers, or aspects of other American culture that you have found either most influential in your countries, either for good or for ill? What specific authors might come to mind when you think about influences from elsewhere?
Oh, you're going to be so disappointed. Because I think actually the strongest influence, when I first came to the United States more than 30 years ago, what impressed me the most was that all the mailboxes and the streetlights and so on, they looked exactly like the ones in the Donald Duck magazines I adored as a child. And the first literary reference I was ever able to pinpoint was, there's one Donald Duck episode where he has shot an albatross, and he's bemoaning the fact. And it wasn't until I got to university that I realized that wasn't actually sort of Disney poetry, but that there was a poem called The Ancient Mariner, and that the Donald Duck story might have a little something to do with that. So it's basically I think, broadly speaking, American pop culture has had the biggest influence on all aspects of Scandinavian life, really. Agnete Storter, we brought her along on tour, and yes, she cheered every time she saw a school bus, because those yellow school buses were to her iconic of her favorite TV series. Yes, another school bus. She counted them, and it was a good day when we saw 3. But she said, but they're all empty. She wanted to see the students inside. If we had been able to bring her to an American high school, she would have been in paradise. And what you'd better tell the audience what she's asked us, or rather asked you to bring home this time.
She's a very sweet girl, and I love her, obviously. But she's also a little funny, and the only thing she wanted from the US were nerds, like little candy things.
Yes, the nerd candies, yeah.
And she wanted me to buy them in a Target, because that's also very from the American TV shows.
And when she heard that we were actually staying in a hotel sort of half a block away from a Target, she said, "Are you going to spend the entire day in there?" I thought, well, maybe not.
Well, she's got a sense of humor also.
She does.
But anyway, as Lena said, the American culture is completely, in television and in music and in everything, basically. Because we're such small countries, we don't produce enough culture. We're not self-sufficient, so to speak.
When it comes to pop culture, no.
So you cannot underestimate that. And of course,
it would be nice to say Moby Dick, but it's not true.
Well, to some maybe it is.
Well, actually, Moby Dick makes a big appearance in Donald Duck magazines too.
Yeah, exactly. So and Hemingway and yes.
Well, speaking of Moby Dick. Herman Melville is a direct influence on my novel. One of the chapters in the novel is built upon Moby Dick. So that's an influence, and among 20th century novelists, it's I think the big generation of Jewish writers are very important to me. Saul Bellow and Bernard Malamud and Joseph Heller.
See, that's what you get when you ask a real writer.
Did we mention that Kim, he won the big Nordic literature prize?
The most influential,
very famous.
Most influential prize in Scandinavian literature.
That's what you get when you listen to the words of the session.
Yeah.
Well,
you get the big prize.
Yeah.
Well, I'm the biggest amateur here because I'm trained, I'm educated as a nurse, and I made my debut very late. But I've always been reading a lot, and I've been reading a lot of American literature, and among new writers, I like the new generation of, what do you call it, the new sincerity? New sincerity.
Sincerity?
It's a new trend in literature, the new sincerity. Haven't you heard about it? Yeah?
Well, it's very new.
For instance,
But very sincere.
well, it's literature that distances itself from 1990s ironic literature. Now we are getting
Now that
sincere
makes sense.
and more serious.
Yeah.
And for instance, I think Ben Lerner is in this generation. Leaving a Torture Station, isn't that name? I've just read that novel. My wife is reading it right now. It's really a wonderful novel, and it goes into the core of where it really hurts, and where you're really stupid, and you tell people about it, and it's funny and it's painful, and I think this is something that American literature is an expert on. To finding the pain and not being ashamed of it and just showing it.
I think Charlie
Philip Roth has the same thing, you know. His especially his early novels, Portnoy's Complaints and so on, they find where it really hurts and they show it to the world, and that's funny and it's painful.
I think Charlie Brown from the Peanuts is a great American literary hero in a sense, and when you said when you talked about the new sincerity, the image that popped into my mind is of him lying, obviously having been bowled over and lost another baseball match, and he lies there with stars around his, sort of circling around his head, and he goes, "How can we lose when we are so sincere?" That's pain and laughter at the same time.
I mean, I read a lot of old books, old literature. My favorite American author is one of the first American authors, Edgar Allan Poe. He has an obsessive way of writing. And I was obsessed with him for a while when I was young. But I also like Kurt Vonnegut very much. I like literature with which has a sort of a reflexive kind of texture. When the literature is looking at itself, sort of, and that's and a lot of what my perspective of America in the 70s and 80s comes from reading authors like Kurt Vonnegut, and he has a way of looking at the American culture which is very interesting, with love and affection and also with criticism. So yeah.
Perhaps we might open up in our remaining minutes to some questions, if any, from the audience. We have about.
What about Kirsty?
Oh, I'm sorry, Chasti. Did you?
No,
Did you?
no, well, yeah. Yes, I remember reading Philip Roth, Everyman, when I wrote my book, where he writes about an older man, I think. But one of the first meetings with American literature was Steinbeck, and when I was much younger, and The Grapes of Wrath, yeah, which made a huge impact on me, and I decided to never vote for anyone but the Socialist Party. I remember. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, one could imagine a kind of an entertainment about Philip Roth called The Grapes of Wrath. Any questions from the audience? We could put the lights up. We could up a bit.
I'd like to ask you, I'd like to direct to the fan of Kurt Vonnegut, whose book I just bought.
Yeah, that's a good choice. Yeah.
How do you guys deal with race in Scandinavian literature? We don't have any.
Yeah.
I'll repeat the question so that everyone can hear it. The question was, how do you deal with race?
No. Well, we don't have that, history with color people as you do. But today, in the last 20, 30 years, there has been a constant immigration into Norway from all over the world, from African countries and from Asian countries. And so today the Norwegian and all the Scandinavian societies are mixed up, not as much maybe as the United States, but it's going in that direction. So race should be, a big topic really in literature, but many of the immigrants are now second generation, third generation, and some of them have become authors. And I think the most interesting works that deals with racism or with discrimination comes from those writers. Norwegian writers, I don't think we're very good at even discussing the topic. I think it's, maybe you can supply me, but I think there is actually a sort of a blank spot there, which maybe should have been filled out.
Yes, I feel that in Denmark, at least, we've sort of been holding off, waiting for voices from, as you said, the second and third generation, and actually now they are starting to come. I think, and especially from our Muslim minority, they have been starting to write, and actually I think it's been sort of suitable for I don't know that the what you would call the ethnic white Dane has not really been writing about it, because I feel that it should be, at least in the beginning, first-hand experiences. So yes, we are sort of holding up, but I think welcoming the voices as they pop up. Yes.
I focus mainly on racism towards Greenlanders, what we call Inuits. They don't want to be called Eskimos. They consider that racism. It's a racist word because it's derogatory. And as John Lennon was singing, a woman is the nigger of the world. You could say that the Greenlanders are the niggers of Denmark, because they are being a subject of racism. And the problem, which there often is with racism, the racists don't know it themselves, so they are sort of racist without knowing it. And this is, of course, for a novelist, an intriguing problem to dive into, and I am using it both in my historical novels and in my contemporary novels about the relationship between Denmark and Greenland.
We attempted in one of our novels a half Roma character, and I was surprised to discover how much prejudice there was among people I knew, whom I knew to be sort of, enlightened and people you would not suspect of harboring that kind of prejudice, but against the Roma, or some people would call them gypsies. But again, terminology when it comes to race is a difficult subject. And I remember we have our character is half Roma in the sense that he grew up. His early childhood was with his mother, and then they were removed. He and his siblings were removed from the home, which sadly is something that happens a lot in Hungary. And then his biological father came and got him out of the orphanage. But when he asked him to take his siblings too, naturally he couldn't, because he wasn't related to them. And so Shandor, this main character, has to live with that sense of betrayal all his life, that his mother told him to take care of his siblings and he couldn't. And then he, in the book, he's a law student, and he's basically trying to keep a low profile and just get his degree and so on, and not be exposed as a Roma, because he's got his father's last name, so he can basically. It's still in Hungary. It's still it's still in Hungary. Yeah. Oh, I thought that was obvious. Never mind. Anyway.
Oh, you're not okay.
No, I wasn't quite done.
Okay.
Sorry. No, the thing is, I quite lost my train of thought there. Hang on a second.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, it's all right. I'm sure you're all waiting with bated breath for the revelation. I'm sorry, I really did lose my. No, you go ahead. I'll think about it meanwhile.
Okay, I was actually. Just had to tell this story about the book with Niels Bayer, which I was talking about, the police detective from the 1700s. There's actually an African person in that book. He's the first colored person in Norway. When I did research for the book, I came over this story about this. Not the first colored person, but the first colored person in Norway to hold an office. In Norway in the 1700s, he was the real man. He lived in another city than I'm writing about, but he was a post officer in Norway in the 1700s, and so I had to, I thought I have to do something about this character, so I put him in my book as a minor character, but he's kind of helping solving the puzzle, really, because he's a very intelligent man and he's a well-read man. And I think the way I treat this problem, because this was a time of racism, indeed. It was a time when Denmark, Norway, which was the same kingdom then, they were starting up the slave trade between Africa and the United States. They participated in that, and but still, this man in my book, he's one of the most interesting characters really in the book, and the way I handle this is the same way I did with Niels Bayer. I'm just making him into a human being, and that's it. I'm not really commenting on racism, on race or anything. He obviously is from Africa, but that's it. I mean, other than that, I'm treating him like just another character in my book.
I've actually managed to catch the thread of my thought, if you're still waiting for it. Well, he's a law student, and of course we went to Hungary, and we were lucky enough to meet a Roma law student whose own story weirdly mirrored the story of our character, in that we thought perhaps we'd been a little harsh on we knew that there was prejudice against Romas in the educational system in Hungary. And we were going to have a professor flunk Shandor, our main character, because he discovered that he was a Roma. And the weird thing was that when this young man who was a law student walked in the door, the first thing he was bursting with it, and he started telling the story before we even said a word about our book. He had actually just had an exam, and these exams are oral exams and they're public. There are other people in the room, where the professor looked at him and said, "You look like a Roma. I'm not interested in hearing anything you have to say," and flunked him. And I said, "Well, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to complain? Aren't you going to complain?" And he said, "Well, he's the dean of the faculty." So I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" He said, "Well, just hope for a different professor next time." Well, anyway, this was quite an eye-opener for us, even though we'd come halfway expecting it. But the thing is, when the book came out in Hungary, actually, one of the commentaries on we could read them online, and someone wrote, "Oh, these people obviously have never been to Hungary, because if they had, they would know that there is no such thing as a Roma law student. So basically, we actually, with our outside perspective, knew a little better.
If I can
go
just
on.
add, and it's just, but I can say that when we do choose to bring in people who have different backgrounds from us, obviously, and what I can say is we cannot do it as well as if it was a real Roma student writing it, but we do take great care in detail, and we do take great care in developing the character, and then praying that it's okay. Yes.
Because there are a lot of Eastern European characters in crime fiction that are either brutal bullies or just seen as victims, and we try to make them people. Sorry? The Laps, the Sami, yeah.
Well,
Can anyone say anything about that?
no, there's no Laplanders in Denmark.
No.
There is.
Well, a scattering perhaps.
There is
but
in Norway and Finland and Sweden.
Yeah.
Yeah. But actually, there was a little debate about that. I didn't, get the whole thing, but it was this Laplander in this Jon Esbø. You know Jon Esbø? He's a Norwegian crime writer, and he's maybe the most famous Norwegian crime writer, or at least the one who is most published around the world. And anyway, he wrote about a Laplander in his latest book, and he got a lot of criticism because the way he portrayed the Laplander in a kind of like stereotypical way, and there was a debate about that. In general, there's not very much literature about Laplanders either. Yeah.
Which simultaneously suggests the limits of Scandinavian literature, but also indicates a possible opening for some talented new writer.
Plenty of
I'd like to extend my thanks to all the participants and to you as well.